Well, good morning, church family. Happy to see each and every one of you and excited for what is now our third week of this sermon series. Excited for the message and to hear from another member of our church, of our congregation. If I could, go ahead and invite you in standing. We have a few songs of worship before we get to this sermon. My foes are many, they rise against me, but I will hold my ground. I will not fear the war, I will not fear the storm. My help is on the way, my help is on the way. And oh my God, will not delay, my refuge and strength always. I will not fear, his promise is true, my God will come through always, always. Trouble surrounds me, chaos abounding, my soul will rest in you. I will not fear the war, I will not fear the storm. My help is on the way, my help is on the way. And oh my God, he will not delay, my refuge and strength always. I will not fear, his promise is true, my God will come through always, always, always. I lift my eyes up, my help comes from the Lord. I lift my eyes up, my help comes from the Lord. I lift my eyes up, my help comes from the Lord. I lift my eyes up, my help comes from the Lord. Oh my God, he will not delay, my refuge
grace, how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy grace, Lord, like a fetter, bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it for thy courts above. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it for thy courts above.
How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son to make a wretch his treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turns his face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold the man upon a cross, my sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. Why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart, his wounds have paid my ransom. Why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart, his wounds have paid my ransom. Thank you all so much for worshiping with us.
All right, good morning. Let's stay standing just for a moment as we look at the next question for our New City Catechism. We're on question 35, and it states, since we are redeemed by grace alone through faith alone, where does that faith come from? So let's read the answer aloud together. All the gifts we receive from Christ we receive through the Holy Spirit, including faith itself. Amen. You may be seated. A couple things to announce before we jump into the text this morning. This past Sunday, we had our chili cook-off. We had our winner, Sandra Barnett, had the most votes for the best chili. Thank you for coming out. Also this week, obviously, Robert, he texted me and he said, hey, I've got the flu, the Thanksgiving flu, and so I'm not going to be able to be here this week. I said, oh no, this is terrible timing. I'm sorry, Robert. Hopefully you can turn around quickly. And it seems like a bad tradition for my family. Does anybody like turkey? Anybody like turkey during Thanksgiving? I'm not particularly a turkey guy. And so he mentioned, well, I'm not going to be able to taste the turkey this year. I said, could you even taste it before? You know, I'm not a big fan of it. I said, I guess it depends on the cook. And he responded with, well, gravy covers all. I was like, that's gold. That is gold, Robert. Thank you for that. And said only a master chef can resurrect a dry bird. But yes, gravy does cover all culinary sins. It was a good text back and forth. Anyway, last week we were reminded that your story, we're talking about testimonies during the month of Thanksgiving, that your story is powerful. Whatever God has done in your life is powerful because God's the one that writes it, not you. And this whole series has been about that, for you to tell his story, because every testimony that we've heard isn't about us, it's about him. And here's the thing, when God moves in your life, he rarely moves quietly. He does it in a way that invites other people to see it, to remember it, to be strengthened by the story. And some of you, you've had moments like that. Moments in your life where you look back and you're like, man, only God could have done something this unique, this special. Only God could have done this. Moments that you come back to again and again because those moments quite literally anchor you into your faith. Moments that you lean on when life gets heavy. God gives us those moments not just to comfort us, but as we talk this morning, it is to strengthen those around us. And that's the heart of Joshua chapter 4. That's where we're going to be this morning if you have a copy of God's Word. If you've got a smartphone, Joshua chapter 4, it's a story about remembering. It's a story specifically about testifying. Faith being passed on, not just to the next generation of children, but to the next generation of believers. And so the setup to this moment is huge. I can't cover necessarily the entire passage this morning, but Israel has spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness because they doubted God. And so they're wandering around. Their parents, they got to see the Red Sea split open by Moses. They saw God deliver them from out of Egypt, but somewhere along the way, Israel has forgotten what God has done. And so when you forget what God has done, and this is part of what I talked about last week and the importance of testimony, what happens is fear kind of grows in those empty spaces. And so now we have a new generation, and they are standing on the edge of this promised land. The Jordan River is overflowing. It's impossible for them to cross, and so the future for them looks uncertain. I mean, Joshua's replaced Moses, so there's a lot of confusion there. There's pressure, there's anxiety, and they have this question: will God be with us? Is he going to make a way? Is he going to do for us what he did for them? And then God does it again. Just like the Red Sea, he holds back the river. The people walk across on dry ground, and God quite literally opens a path for them when there was no path. It's one of the greatest miracles in the Old Testament, and God is saying something surprising. He's saying, hey, don't you dare forget this. Build something that makes you remember what has happened here. 12 stones, one for each tribe. Stack them up as a memorial. A visible reminder of God's faithfulness, a conversion starter, a testimony in rock form. And so God tells them why, so that when someone asks, what does this mean? You can tell them about me. You see, this whole entire passage that we're about to cover is God saying, hey, look, your story is not meant to stay silent. Your story is meant to strengthen someone else's faith. That's what testimonies do. They build up the church. They encourage the discouraged. They anchor the doubting. They remind us who God is, how God works, why we can trust God. They're so important for us to share. And in just a moment, after we open this passage, we're going to hear another story, another testimony of God's faithfulness in one of our own here at Harmony. But before we do, I want to walk you through Joshua 4 because this chapter shows you why your story should matter, why telling his story strengthens the church. So Joshua 4, it opens. Israel has just walked through this miracle that I've told you about. The Jordan River has now stopped flowing. The ground is dry, and the people are standing on the other side now with a story that nobody could deny. So let's read Joshua 4, verse 1. Take 12 men, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the midst of the Jordan, from the very place the priest's feet stood firm, and bring them over to you. And the question is why? Why not just let this moment speak for itself? Something beautiful just happened. Why not just sit in it for a second? Just enjoy the miracle. God knows how quickly we forget him. You see, Israel, they had seen God split the Red Sea 40 years earlier, but that generation, they doubted. They complained. They rebelled because they forgot who God was and what he had already done for them. And so God said, hey, we're not doing that again here. You're going to mark this moment so you never forget who I am. And this is important. This is the first point if you're taking notes, is that testimonies don't exist just to remind you of who you are. They exist to remind you of who God is. And that's why God tells them to take stones from where? The middle of the river. Not from the shore, not from just some random pile over here, from the place where the presence of God stood, the place where the miracle actually happened. He wants those stones to actually say something to the people. He wants Israel to look at these stones, to remember that God led us here. It was God that made a way. It was God that kept his promise. It was God that stood with us in the middle of something impossible. And so Joshua takes the stones and he stacks them in Gilgal, and then he tells the people the purpose behind it in verse 6. So go to verse 6. It says that this may be a sign among you. So that way when your children ask, hey, what do these stones mean? Well, then you can tell them. The waters of the Jordan were cut off before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. And when it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. So in other words, when someone sees this memorial, when they see these stones and they ask, hey, what happened? You don't tell them about yourself. You tell them about God. Again, what I've been saying the last several weeks is that this is the heart of your testimony that God has given you. This is at the heart of it. It's simply pointing back to the place where God has met you. It's pointing back to the place where God has helped you, where God has carried you through something difficult, where God has rescued you, and then you turning around and saying, let me tell you who God is. And some of you have those kind of stones in your life. God has purposely given you those stones in your life. Maybe that was the night that God saved you. And for you, that has become a memorial stone that is rooted deeply into the core of who you have become. And so you look back to that night that you surrendered everything to Christ, because in that moment, everything changed for you and it became a stone. Maybe it was a season where God just carried you through something awful in your life. Maybe he carried you through a season of grief, and that has become a memorial stone for you. Maybe it was a moment that God quite literally has broken an addiction in your life, We heard a testimony about that from week 1. Maybe it was a job that God provided for you when you didn't have anything. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's a marriage that he's restored, that was on the verge of divorce, and he has reconciled again. Maybe it is the fear in your life as you were dealing with something that he calmed for you. Maybe it was shame in your life that he took the weight of it off of your shoulders, or strength that he's given you when you had no strength. And those are stones that God has placed in your story. They're meant to be these beautiful reminders for you, for others, of what God has done in your life. Testimonies work the same way as the stones did for Israel. They anchor you, they steady you, they calm you, they bring you back to the truth, but they also help other people see God more clearly. This is why we're doing this series, because the church is strengthened. The people of God remember who he is. And one of the primary ways that we remember is by hearing how God has worked in somebody else's life. When they looked at these stones, they didn't just sit around and say, wow, that's a beautiful monument. That's a really beautiful memorial. They didn't admire the rocks. They remembered the God who quite literally opened the river for them. When someone hears your testimony, it's the same way. They don't just sit there and say, oh, that was a beautiful story. They don't admire you and praise you for how awesome and cool and wonderful you are. The purpose of the testimony is to remember him, to remember Christ, what he's done in your life. And here's the thing that might surprise you. Sometimes God gives you a specific testimony that you didn't ask for. That's kind of the hard truth here to swallow, is that sometimes he's going to give you something in your life that you didn't quite ask for, because he simply intends to use it to strengthen someone else's faith. So you're questioning, why, God? Why would you do this to me? But he's got a purpose for it over here in somebody else's life. Now, this isn't, like I talked about last week, not in like a God causes your pain kind of situation. Joshua 4 is not talking about that. The text we covered last week isn't talking about that. It's not that God causes your pain. It's that God wastes nothing. God isn't the author of sin. He's not the author of your pain in life. He is a good God. But he can take something terrible and turn it into something beautiful. He wastes nothing. He doesn't waste the river that you had to cross. God doesn't waste the fear that you felt, the miracle that he worked in your life. All of it becomes a way for God to show himself through you to his people. And so point one is really actually simple. Your story helps the church remember who God is. So when you tell what God's done for you, you're stacking stones. When you tell other people the miracle, the beauty, the grace that God has given you in your life, you're stacking stones in someone else's faith. You're giving them something to look at and say, God is faithful. God is good. God can redeem. God can restore. God is still working. And so after these stones, they're taken from the Jordan, and then they're carried all the way to the camp at Gilgal, and they're set down. The story slows down a little bit, and so Joshua, he doesn't rush the narrative anymore. And this is important because the stones, it wasn't just about them looking back. That's a part of it. That's point one. But it's not just about looking back at the stones and remembering. They're about to do something ridiculous. And God is preparing his people for what's to come next. Remember, Israel, they had just crossed enemy lines. So they're in enemy territory. They weren't stepping into comfort. They were stepping into conflict. And Jericho, it's right in front of them. We know what happens at Jericho. Giants are ahead of them. Nations are watching. And so God knew that they would need something to hold on to the moment that fear would try to creep in. And that's what testimonies do. They build courage to take the next step. Look at verse 10. It says, "For the priests bearing the ark, they stood in the midst of the Jordan until everything was finished. That the Lord commanded Joshua to tell the people according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. The people passed over in haste." That word haste doesn't mean panic. It's an eagerness. It's a confidence. It's movement. It's that they were moving forward with confidence. They recognized that God's with us. God took care of us. God is going before us. God can be trusted here. This miracle, alongside their memory of God's power, puts faith in their feet. It puts faith in their feet. It strengthened them for what God is about to do. And the next verse explains why that matters. In verse 12, it says, "The sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh, they passed over armed before the people of Israel, as Moses had told them." Verse 13, "About 40,000 ready for war passed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho." And that's significant. It's a really important detail. A generation earlier, Israel saw giants and they ran. And here, they're stepping into this land with a sense of confidence, eagerness, haste. What's the difference? They remembered what God had done. Verse 14, "On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all of Israel, so they stood in awe of him as they had stood in awe of Moses." Why would that matter? Why is that an important detail? Well, for Israel, leadership brings a sense of fear. It was a fear point for Israel. Moses was gone. Joshua is unproven. And here he is. The people needed to know, is God really with this man? Is God with him? They needed confidence in God's appointed leader. This miracle was God confirming to the people that, hey, I'm with Joshua in the same way that I was with Moses. So he's bringing confidence into these people. It strengthened the community. Joshua's obedience became quite literally part of their testimony. Let me say that again. Joshua's obedience became part of their testimony. It strengthened their faith. And the same thing for you. Here's point 2. When God works in your life and you share what God has done, testimonies strengthen the faith of people around you. It leads them to obedience. Listen, your testimony isn't just a story of, hey, here's what God did in my life. It's fuel for trusting what God is going to do in your life. That's why God doesn't tell Israel. He doesn't tell them to build this memorial after Jericho fell. That's in chapter 6. Here we are in chapter 4. He tells them to build this memorial before they fought a single battle, before they marched, before the walls fell, before they saw victory. They built a memorial because God knows how faith is strengthened when you remember what has already been done. And so think about your own life for a moment. Think about the memorial stones that you've built up in your life. When God's provided for you once, it's a lot easier for you to trust him again. When God's carried you through something painful in your life, you have confidence, hey, God's not going to leave me now because he carried me through it back there. When God has rescued you from sin in your life, addiction, fear, shame, when he rescues you out of that, listen, you are quicker to believe that God can transform another area of your life. And you believe it. And so when you share that story, it doesn't just help you, it helps the church. It helps all of us. Israel marched forward because someone else's obedience and someone else's miracle strengthened their faith. That's why they could march forward. Thousands of them marched forward because of somebody's miracle, somebody's story. See, when someone shares what God has done, how he's provided for them, how he's healed them, how he's saved them and sustained them and protected them, how God has restored them, how he was faithful to them, suddenly that person that's listening to that story, they're sitting there thinking, hey, man, I needed to hear that. All of a sudden, they're thinking, if God did it for them, maybe he can do it for me too. Maybe they're sitting there listening to the story like last week, and they're sitting there thinking, I'm not the only one dealing with that. I'm not alone in this. God really is working among other people. That's why God commands Israel to build a memorial, to stack the stones before Jericho, not after. God is about to ask them to do something ridiculous, and they need this. God's saying, look, you're going to need to remember who I am, and you're going to need to tell this story again. Remembering what God has done, it strengthens you for what God is calling you to do next. That's the point. That's why the New Testament over and over and over again says stuff like encourage one another. It says stir one another up in love to do good works. It says encourage one another daily, comfort one another with these words. Bear one another's burdens. Do not forsake the habit of meeting together regularly. God uses you. He uses your story to strengthen someone else's obedience. That's the beauty of it. Your testimony might be exactly what someone else needs to trust God in their battle. Testimonies are God's way of quite literally preparing his people for what is ahead. And the same is true for us. So, the church needs your story, not because it's impressive, not because we're glorifying past mistakes or past sins, but because the God that is in your story is faithful. And so what happens here is that Joshua finishes setting up these stones. But before this chapter even ends, he explains that there's a much bigger reason here for why these stones matter. Why this even matters in the first place. Look, it's not for Israel's memory. I get that that's one of the points, but that's not the main point. It is for them to look back on. It's also not just for the next generation's faith. The text mentions that, but that's still not the main point. The main point is for the nations that are watching. And this is my third point. Testimonies declare God's saving power. Testimonies declare God's saving power. Let's look at verse 21, and we'll read it to the end. It says, and he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Well, then you shall let your children know that Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. In case you've missed it, there you have it in verse 24, the main point. In verse 24, you have the mission of God in one sentence. God's telling Israel, what I did for you, it's not just for you. Your testimony is larger than just you. It's how the world is going to know who I am. It's going to show the world my power. And this is where testimony becomes more than just personal encouragement to you. It's been very encouraging to hear the testimonies that we've had all month long, but it's more than just personal encouragement. It becomes witness. It becomes another way that God reveals himself to the world. When God says right here in this passage, he's like, hey, tell them this story, tell them what's happened. He's really saying, hey, tell them my story. Tell them my story. Israel doesn't get the glory for this. God gets the glory. The stones, they don't point to the faith of the people. Oh, they had all this awesome faith, and look what God did for them because they were obedient and they had all this faith. That's not the point. It points to the faithfulness of God. That even though that they wandered, that they rebelled, that they complained, that they were terrible, God still makes a way. And notice the phrase that Joshua repeats right here over and over again. He says, when Israel passed over the Jordan. He says, when the Ark of the Covenant passed over. When you passed over. He uses Passover 11 times in this passage. Now, I was reading through it, and it just like stood out to me. It's just glaring when you start to look at it. The phrase Passover, it's not just geography. It's theology. Israel didn't just climb out of slavery on their own. They didn't push back the river. Israel didn't make a way for themselves. They didn't hold back impending death. They passed over because God stood in the middle of something that they couldn't cross. Verse 7, it makes it unmistakable. Verse 7, it says, when the Ark of the Covenant passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So here's this detail that we just can't miss. The Ark of the Covenant here, the visible symbol of God's presence. That's what the Ark of the Covenant is. Visible symbol of God's presence stepped into the river first. Death stopped because God stepped in. Judgment paused, a way opened because God passed through first. In the very next chapter, Joshua 5, something strange happens before Israel fights Jericho, before they lift a sword, before they march around walls, before they battle anybody. God takes them through something deeply symbolic, and he tells them in chapter 5, I want you to celebrate the Passover. A reminder of the lamb, the blood that was shed to save them in Egypt, that salvation comes through a substitute. So why would God do all this before they fight? Well, he wanted Israel. He also wanted the world to know that God saves his people. God delivers his people. He brings his people through. He identifies his people. He fights for his people. The Jordan River points to a greater reality for us. It points to a greater reality that we crossed from death to life because the greater Joshua, Jesus Christ, stepped into the river for us. And that's the symbolism. Just as the priests, they stood in the middle of the flood waters with an ark, the presence of God that was holding back the judgment that should have swept everybody away. Jesus at the cross, he stands in the flood of God's wrath in our place, holding back God's judgment, opening a way where there was no way, so not even a drop of God's wrath would land on you. And you could cross over from death to life on dry ground. Israel passed over the Jordan. We passed from death to life. Israel had stones to remember redemption. We have a cross to remember ours. Israel told their children, hey, look what God did. We tell the world, look what Jesus has done. Just like the memorial stones, your testimony, it doesn't point to your strength. It points to his salvation, and it says that, hey, this is where God has met me. This is where God carried me, where God rescued me, where he forgave me, he changed me, where I passed over because he passed first. That's why your testimony matters. It doesn't just encourage believers, it reveals God to unbelievers. It doesn't just strengthen the church, it quite literally puts the gospel on display. It leaves memorial stones in the lives of others. It declares the God who passed over us in mercy, who stood in the flood for us, who made a way where there was no way. That is the God who saves. But notice Joshua 4, it ends with the mission, right? That last verse, verse 24, It was so that all the peoples may know. That's the purpose of the stones. It was so that everyone would know. It's the same mission Jesus gave the disciples in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, where he says, hey, you will be my witnesses so that all the world may know. Witnesses do one thing. They tell what they've seen God do. If you're a witness to something, you're going to tell what you've seen God do. That's a testimony. That's Joshua 4. That is your story, and that's why we tell his story. As we step back from Joshua chapter 4, there is a clear pattern that God always uses. There's a clear pattern that God always uses in how he forms us, how he strengthens us, how he sends his people. It goes like this. He saves us, then he brings you through, and then he stands in the middle of what you can't cross. That's the way that it always works. And then he says, hey, now go and tell what I've done. Go and tell. I mean, this series, it's not about elevating anyone's past. It's not about spotlighting anybody's pain. It's certainly not about comparing whose story is bigger, because like we've said, the power of your story is not you. It is the glory of his grace. Because every testimony is a memorial stone pointing to the one who has saved us. So your story is going to remind somebody else of who God is. Your story strengthens the church for what's coming next. For us to look at your story and say, I know what God will do for us in the future. Your story declares God's saving power to a world that desperately needs to hear that he still does miracles today. And I'm one of them. God didn't just save you from something, he saved you for something, to go and be my witnesses. He saved you so you could bear witness to his grace. He says, you'll be my witnesses, not experts. He didn't ask you to be a philosopher. He didn't ask you to be a theological guru. He said, be a witness. Tell what you've seen me do. Look, I'm not asking you to go and evangelize by standing on a street corner with a picket sign. It's not the purpose of this series. I'm not asking you to go door to door and try to convince people to convert. Let's face it, that doesn't work. Not asking you to go pass out flyers and gospel tracts in your spare time. I'm just asking you to do what God commanded you to do. To tell people what you've seen God do in you. That's the power of your story. It's the glory of his grace. So this morning, we have the privilege of hearing another one of those stones of remembrance. A testimony of God's presence, God's protection, God's faithfulness. Now, just like the stones from Joshua chapter 4, her story is not about drawing attention to herself. It's about pointing us to the God that goes before us, who stands with us in deep waters, who brings us safely to the other side. And some of you in this room, you do need to hear what God's done in her life. Some of you, you need the encouragement that her story is going to carry. And some of you, you need the reminder that, hey, if God was faithful to her, he's going to be faithful to you. So would you join me in welcoming Teresa Uridia to the stage? Thank you for doing this, Teresa. You were one of the first people that I asked. I was excited for this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it like we've done every week. And so I'm just going to ask you some questions. Take your time. Okay. And let's point it to Jesus. So one of the most unique, one of the most beautiful things that I heard from your testimony was just that you were quite literally a miracle from birth, from the day that you were born. Can you just share a little bit about that?
Of course. Can you hear me? Okay. So From my time of conception, my mother was 45 years old when she conceived me, and just about to turn 46 when I was born. The doctor came to my father and let him know, I can either save your wife or I can save your child. And of course, my father chose his wife. They kept this from me till I was in my preteens for whatever reluctance I can understand. But, even if I had to put myself in their position, I probably would have did the same. So, although the doctors had told my dad, it's one or the other, I'm here and God had a different plan for me.
So let me ask you, knowing that story, how has that given you an understanding of God's purpose for your life?
Well, just as you say, or you talked about today's sermon with the river, one of the things it has taught me is that no matter how wide, how deep, that river can be, that God is almighty and he has a purpose and he has the possibility of doing whatever in your life.
He knitted you together in your mother's womb.
He did.
He knows how many hairs you have on your head.
Yes.
He knows us that intimately. And for me to understand that is sheer grace, but you getting to experience that, I'm sure gives you just fuel and fire for knowing, hey, God is going to do something in my life because of that. And so one of the things is that you grew up in a Christian home. So give us just a little picture of what that early faith looked like and how the Lord first became real to you in your life.
Well, from as far as I can remember, I've been in the church as a child. One of the things my mother fostered with us is, hey, I don't care, even as we got older, I don't care what you do on Saturday, unless you're ill, can't walk, can't get up, you will be in church. That carried on through my family. I did grow up in a very loving and ethical family that put God first in our lives. And I think as I grew from a child to a teen to an adult, that carried over in every decision I made, because my family made sure that I knew with every action there was a consequences. And it took it back to Christ and the word of the Bible, that before you act, you thought of that consequences.
Wow.
And would it be something that God would be pleased or displeased with?
That's something a lot of people don't do today. Think before they act. And, we had a neat conversation in the difference of our childhoods. And I think that one of the beautiful things that you described was simply that almost the routine of going to church, whether or not you wanted to, you probably didn't. There was probably Sundays where you don't want to show up either, where your kids fight you. Benjamin fought us all morning this morning, and he's like, I don't want to go to church. And we're like, you're going, buddy. You don't have a choice here. It quite literally became a memorial stone for you.
It did, and it came from being a child that, hey, you thought your parents were forcing you to get up and go to church every Sunday, to looking forward to it and thriving when you got there, and going to Sunday school and reading the Bible and learning about the scripture. And it even evolved, because my aunt, who did not have kids of her own, she would make sure that kids in the neighborhood, if their parents did not bring them to church, she would go pick them up every Sunday. And even after we finished worship at our own church, we would go visit other churches and support their programs. So it really gave me deep roots to what Christianity was about, what serving the Lord was about at an early age.
Yeah, I love the phrase deep roots, right? And which play an important role in what we'll talk about here in a minute. But and you were saved early, right? I think you said 12. And so how did your relationship with Jesus grow from that moment to maybe some of the teenage and adult years?
So as I said, being in the church from childhood, I didn't actually accept and give my life to Christ, although I knew Christ from the beginning. I was in a revival, and that is when I gave my life to Christ. And you know, it wasn't the first day of the revival. It wasn't the second day of the revival. It was like mid-revival. And I think the whole time that I sat there, I knew all along that my life belonged to Christ. But you know, as a child, you're sitting there and you're going like, well, I don't want people to think I'm doing it because they got up and did it, you know, or am I choosing the right time to do that? So, you know, those first few days, I did wrestle with that. But when the third day came, you know, whether I wanted to or not, it was like something lifted me off the seat and said, go. And, you know, from there, giving my life to Christ just made me closer to him and just wanting to serve in the manner that he wanted me to serve.
Yeah, and you're full of incredible wordings here. And one of the things that I noticed in this is just that it's not necessarily a prayer that saves you, right? It's when you surrender your life to Jesus. And I say this because so many people have a false sense of assurance about their salvation because they prayed this prayer when they were young. They got dunked in the water and went swimming. And they think for the rest of their life, I'm good. But then there's no obedience, there's no follow through, there's no life change, there's no transformation. And so when I read this book, that it was a really insightful book that was called Stop Asking Jesus Into Your Heart. And it sounds ridiculous at first, but the reality is we say that prayer, but that's not found anywhere in Scripture. If I tell you to repeat after me to say a prayer of salvation, and you just recite that prayer and that's your sign, sealed, and delivered to heaven, then we're no different than witches giving an incantation. It has nothing to do with the specific words. It has to do with the heart posture and the obedience that follows after that life change. It's about surrendering your life to the Lord. I love that. I love the way that you say that. And I wish that more people had that testimony.
But you know, it's also not an easy thing. You think because I grew up in the church and I was always in the church and I always had the faith and had faith in God. Growing up as a teenager and in that thing, it really could turn kids off from you. You know, I often got labeled as, you know, look at little Miss Goody Two-Shoes, or, you know, because my mother always taught me, and this phrase that she told me always stuck with me. She goes, don't go along to get along. So, you know, when I would question about things other kids were doing, she would go like, okay, if they're gonna jump off a cliff, would you do it just because?
Yeah.
So it really made you think about it, you know. So there were pressures, the peer pressures of, you know, kids not liking you because, you know, I was structured. You know, I knew if I did a certain thing and I knew what the outcome was gonna be, whereas maybe they didn't have that structure and they didn't understand. But, you know, as a child being labeled differently, and you have so much of that in schools these days called bullying, you know, it can be devastating. But the one thing I thank God for is that structure. You know, it came to me from family members, it came to me from church members. You're not here to please man, you're here to please God. So regardless of what words they say about you, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. I think every believer has moments where they feel like God has stood in the river, where God was standing in the river for them, moments where his presence is unmistakable or his protection becomes a stone, a memorial stone in your life. So can you share a time where you realized that God was the one that was carrying you through something difficult?
Well, you asked for a testimony, but my testimony is ongoing. It started at birth.
Amen. Yeah.
I served in the military. I was over in Desert Storm. There was a interception of a Scud missile, and we weren't notified. By the time we looked up, it was being blown up. So, you know, if there was gas or whatever there, we would have all been dead. So, interception by God, you know. Other things that have happened in my life, you know, God has always been there. there's a situation, my birth, the military. In my 30s, a high school friend that we decided to date, formed a relationship, started a business together, etc. And I think the success and the money just turned him dark. And from there, I had to ask the Lord because it was going in a whole different direction. We were in a banquet facility, which required lots of time during the weekend. So he became more and more focused on the money. We got more and more away from the church, and I know that wasn't the path for me. So, I had conversations with the Lord, and I was like, God, this is not where I want to be. So I did break off the relationship. Well, it turned very ugly. He became a stalker. I was stalked for over a year. I did not share it with my family because I knew my family was very protective and I didn't want them to end up in jail for doing something to him. So I went through it. I had friends, but we had mutual friends. So every friend that I had, he was constantly calling them, telling them stories about me. High school friends that we went with had, I heard whispers of, what is she doing to him? It was all about what I was doing to him, never about what he was doing to me. I was stalked at home. I literally was a prisoner in my own home. I would go to work, and even sometimes he would show up at my house as I'm trying to leave, follow me to work, call me at work. I wouldn't answer the phone. Then he would page me, call the receptionist, have him page me all day long. I would rush home, and I always had to keep my doors and my windows locked, closed. I didn't share this with my family because I didn't want them to get involved, and he was very manipulative, so he knew exactly how to set a stage to make someone react, to give him that power. At first I started the question, and I caught myself in midstream. I said, God, why me? I was getting ready to say, why me? But then I changed it, and I said, God, this is not what I want. If you have a plan for me, let me know. So from that time, I broke off the relationship. He continued the harassments and things. I felt that, he goes, let's go to counseling. So because he wasn't listening to me, I felt maybe if he heard it from someone else, it would dig in. No. We went to a spiritual counselor. They basically told him, you're not married to her. You don't have a ring on her finger. You don't have a reason to just think you can pop up or show up, or she needs to answer your calls, etc. So that didn't work. So he goes, okay, let's go to a counselor. And I was like, okay, God, maybe these are the steps that I need to take to get him the help that he wants. That didn't work. And she called me after the first session with him, and she said to me, Teresa, I'm going to tell you, because throughout all of this, he was always threatening to kill himself, which made me feel like I would be responsible if he died. Always threatening to kill himself. And she said, Teresa, let me tell you something. If you are through with this guy, walk away, don't look back. She said, because first of all, from my conversation with him, he loves himself too much to do anything to himself. And he's using this as a tool to keep you in his life. So the turning event that God gave me is, it was a Saturday evening, and he called. And he told me, he said, I'm coming to your house, and I'm going to shed my blood in your driveway. And so, for someone to tell you that is just, first of all, mind-blowing. I'm a very strong person, but, not that strong, because that's the last thing you want etched in your mind is someone dying because of you. So, I had that conversation with God, and it's like, God, what am I to do? God gave me the sense. He said, call one of your friends. I called her, and I said, where's your husband? I really need him to come. And she goes, he's on the other side of town, but I'm going to call him, and he's on his way. So God told me, seek refuge in one of my back bedrooms at the very back of the house. And he did show up. And I heard 2 to 3 gunshots that he fired. And, I think he fired the gunshots as a way to get me to open the door so that he could get to me. But God told me to be still. So I stayed still. After he didn't get a reaction, I heard him start his truck and leave. So I called my friend, let her know, it appears that he's left. But guess what? He left and he came back. He left to go and dispose of the weapon, but he came back. And he started to go all around my house and shake all of my windows and doors. And although I wasn't getting much outside, for some reason that day I went outside on my patio just to catch a breath of air and forgot to put that security bar there. So he was able to gain access to my home. I heard him break in. I was in the back room. So, a lot of, you wonder why God sends you different places at different times. I think he sent me to the military to have that survival instinct. So God told me, be still. As I heard him entering different rooms through the house and getting closer to me, God gave me the opportunity to see that, okay, he's in that room, make a run for it. I did run, but, here I am 5'3", my short legs, and he was 6'2", so he could cover quite a bit of ground more than I. So when I did try to reach my neighbors, unfortunately, he caught me and grabbed me by the arm and pulled me back into the house. What God did allow me to do, having that military background, he kind of had me pushed up against a kitchen cabinet, and there was a drawer, and it had a knife. So I was able to arm myself and fend him off until my friend's husband showed up. So he did show up before the cops got there. Being the person that he was, my friend's husband told him, man, leave, the cops are on his way. You couldn't tell him anything. It was all about him. Well, let him come. They showed up, and he literally told them, oh, we've been in business together. I called her. I told her I was coming. We've been in a relationship. And so they looked at me and they asked me, did you invite him in? And I said, no. And so they looked at him and said, that is breaking and entering. They also searched his truck, and although he had disposed of the gun, he still had the box that held the gun there. So they did take him to jail, and I got a phone call, and he calls and he goes, you need to come get me out. And I was like, no, you put yourself in there. He goes, but I'm in here with a bunch of criminals and I don't belong here. And I said, I will do you one favor. I'll call your mother and your brother, and they can do what they want about that situation. Well, needless to say, it still did not solve the harassment. But, God gave me the fact that, he let me know that, first of all, he's not in control. I'm in control. Mm-hmm. He gave me all of the survival skills and the instincts to survive the situation. That was God. That wasn't me. My story could have ended in a very, very different way. Different, for sure. And, it's nothing short of God's hand of protection, right? Yes. And
I don't have this question written down, but I think that there's people that may have walked through abusive situations. Maybe it is stalking, maybe it is more physical in the home. Maybe they've witnessed their parents go through that. And so where's the redemption? Where is God's hand of grace on that?
Well, you know what? To tell you the truth, I was furious. I was angry, you know, that I could be treated by someone that said they loved me and that I had known for such a long time in that manner. And I did carry that anger with me for a while. But, you know, and we'll talk about that later, Ed and I did get married, and in the early stages of our marriage, I just felt weighed down, Brad. There was some weight on my shoulder that was just there. And you know, God touched my heart and he said, call him. And he said, you don't have to forget what he did to you, but you do have to forgive him. And I think that was one of the hardest things for me to do. But you know, even when I reached out and made that phone call to him, he said to me, if I had to do it all over again, I would. And I said to him, I've done what God has put on my heart. Whatever you do with it is you. I forgive you. You know, what you do with your part is on you and between you and God. So, you know, I think that's the redemption. God lets you know that regardless of what you go through and what situation you go through, the redemption part is that he's always there for you. It may not turn out the way you think it should, but there's always a plan that he's got in play.
And part of that plan is the wonderful marriage that you have, and I'm particularly a big fan of his too. And so, how has your husband played a role in the healing, the growth, your walk with Christ now?
Well, you know, I have to start that with a story of how Ed and I met. So, of course, I was still going through the situation. Ed didn't really know about it, but we met. I was flying home to see my mother, and he worked out of Indianapolis, Indiana, probably every few weeks. We both ended up on the last seat on an airplane to a connecting flight in Atlanta. There was the flight attendant in the jump seat. Ed was in the middle, and I was at the window seat. So we all introduced ourselves, and, you know, this flight attendant was, I should say, very into my now husband. You know, so they continued to talk, and I was like, wow, they're hitting it off pretty well. Well, I'm trying to catch a nap in between connecting flights, so I didn't think anything of it. As we made it to Atlanta and was deplaning, you know, I saw her slipping her business card saying, hey, call me next time you're coming through Atlanta. We can grab lunch or dinner. I'm walking to my connecting flight and I hear someone calling my name. And I was like, who in the Atlanta airport knows me? So I turn around and it's Ed. In our conversations and introductions, I was working for IBM at the time, and he approached me. He said, you know, my company's looking to upgrade their hardware system. Next time I'm in town, maybe we can have dinner or lunch and talk about the project.
It's a good move, good move.
So, you know, being a professional business person, you carry business cards. I'm used to people asking for the business card. So, of course, I gave it and said, sure, you know, didn't even give it a second thought. Well, 2 weeks later, sure enough, he was in town and he made that phone call. We did talk about business for several hours, but we also just talked for hours. And, you know, it was almost like we had known each other forever. You know, there were similarities in likes and dislikes. You know, he was a Christian, I was a Christian, our beliefs lined up, and it just grew. Every time he was in town, we would get together for dinner or lunch, and, you know, it grew. Well, the ex-boyfriend was still lurking, so as I would travel or whatever, he had got to the point where he had a private eye giving him my every whereabouts. And he tried to do a bait with Ed. Somehow he got his phone number and called him and said, hey, we need to meet up. Ed made me aware of the situation, and, I didn't let him know at that time everything that had gone on, but I said, don't do it. I said, it's not a test of your manhood. I said, he's trying to set you up. And, he did say things to Ed that could have probably turned the average man away and say, hey, I want no part of this drama. But, I think Ed had got to know me for me, and he knew in his heart that, some of the things that were being said about me were not true. He did listen. He didn't meet up with him or anything. But my mother passed away before Ed and I officially got married. And guess who shows up at our funeral? It's my ex and his mother. And, he approaches Ed and his mother, and he's all smirk, and he's introducing himself like Ed doesn't know who he is. And so he tried to make a scene at my mother's funeral. It was scripted. Like with any funeral, you have certain people on the program. You ask that no others get up and speak. Well, he got up and spoke anyway, and in a very disrespectful way to my mother. We were leaving the church to go to the burial site, and he approaches my car window, and he's knocking on the window. I need to talk to you. And I'm like, Lord, this is a test of my religion, because this is not the day. So, I tried to kindly tell him, you just need to step back. This is my mother's day, and you don't need to be trying to interfere in any way. Well, you need to agree to meet with me. And so just to get him away and not make me lose my religion on the church ground, I did agree to meet with him in a very public place. But he still was at the same tactics. I stayed in my car. He was talking to me through the window. He reaches in and snatches my car keys and drive away. And I called his mother and I said, look, this is beyond. But just like with everyone else that he manipulated, he always told them it's because I love her so much. But that's not love. That is not love at all. And, I can say when I did start a friendship and a relationship with Ed, the last thing on my mind was a relationship, with another man after going through that. But God put it back to my father, who I knew was a very loving family man. And he pointed out, and look at who I brought into your life, who's a very loving man. Not all men are created equal, and not all men are the same. So, he opened that door. So needless to say, I can say Ed has been very supportive. One of my family members who was a minister that my ex had also called and told stories, he goes, well, are you with Ed because of a rebound situation? And he said, what makes it different? And I had to tell him, I said, you know what? When I'm down on myself, Ed is up on me. When I am down, he's lifting me up. He puts me first, not before God, but first in his life. It's always about what can I do to make things better for you. It's not a selfish thing, and we do that with each other. We give to each other in that same manner. So when I saw that difference, and I was like, okay, God, I asked you what plan you had for me, and he showed it.
We'll do it like we've done the last few weeks. So I'll ask you one more question, and then we'll dismiss from here. I'll pray, and then we'll get out of here. But one of the themes of today's passage is that sometimes, God brings his people through the waters so that all the peoples may know that he is mighty. What would you encourage others with today, maybe even those who are in the deep waters right now?
Well, what I say is, first, have a conversation with God. Don't lose faith, because regardless how good you think your life is, there are always going to be troubles and triumphs. And what I say is the devil and his minions are constantly just sitting there waiting for the opportunity to have you doubt your faith in God and your faith in Jesus. And just as I started to ask that question to God, and I had to stop and think about it, stop, and think about. I remember just hearing not too long ago, he said, we are quick to say all of the things that we haven't been blessed with. But if you actually took a notepad and annually written down everything that God has blessed you for, you would be totally surprised. So, I say we all go through storms, but, God has proved time and time again that he's there for us. And my mother's favorite verse in the Bible, which I say to you, if you're struggling and you don't have someone to talk to, take it to God. And secondly, go to the Bible. Read a verse that speaks to your situation. That had gotten me through so many hard times when you feel that you are just in despair and there's no way out. A sermon, Brad, often sometimes, and I have minister brothers and they tell me all the time, I practiced for this sermon and I got up and God just put something different for me to speak on. And it's because he's using you. There's someone out there that had to hear what he wanted you to say. So, be open to that. Yes, there are going to be trials, there's going to be tribulations, and I think that's a part of having faith, because God does have to test us sometimes just to see. And I think all the things that I have been through in my life, it has been a test. And he just wanted me to see that, although things may knock you down, hold on to that faith and get back up, but always keep me first in your life. And as the 23rd Psalm says, he's our shepherd, he's there, he's our protector. And I didn't know why my mother really loved that verse until I got into adulthood and I started to break it down. It just tells you the shepherd part, first of all, that relationship building with God. And then that ultimate verse where he is promising you eternal life in his house. Who other than God can do that?
Thank you. Thank you for being vulnerable. Thank you for sharing. Thank you so much, Teresa. Let me pray, and then we'll get out of here. King Jesus, we thank you so much for the life that you have given Teresa. We thank you for her wisdom, the things and the memorial stones that you've planted in her life for her to share with us. Father, I pray that there would be somebody in this room that would take what she said this morning and that they would apply it to their life. Father, I pray that you would be glorified and honored through her testimony of your power, your glory. And God, we just ask as a church that we would continue to be strengthened through these stories that we've heard. Father, I pray that if there's anybody in this room that is walking through something similar, Father, if somebody in this room is struggling in a similar situation, that they would first turn to you and that they would seek help. Father, we pray that as a church we would unite together under the bond of us all being changed by your grace, but that we would also reach out to one another, that we would care for one another, that we would love one another. And so we just are so grateful for this opportunity. We thank you for the good things that you're doing in the life of this church and in the life of your people. It's in your holy and precious name that we pray. Amen.